A whisper in the fog, a secret too heavy for even the river to drown. Somewhere beneath London's shifting mist, a truth lies coiled in silence, waiting to be unearthed. This is a tale of guilt that won't stay buried, of shadows that return when least expected. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was on a damp October morning, when the fog hung so low over Baker Street that the street lamps still glowed like spectral eyes at midday, that I found Holmes in one of his more abstracted moods. The fire crackled half-heartedly, untouched since morning, and the air held a chill that even my thick Inverness could not keep out. I had long since ceased to expect consistency in my friend's temper, but there was in his silence that day something unusually brittle, something that suggested his formidable mind was grasping at a thread not yet visible to mine. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, his eyes closed, the battered violin across his lap, one string detached and dangling like a line over still water. He neither smoked nor read, both habits he employed when idle. The Times lay at his feet, unopened and trodden upon, as though the news of the world had offended him merely by existing. I ventured a remark about the stillness of the week, but he waved it off. "There is peace, Watson," he murmured, plucking the violin string once, "but it is the peace of a pond, opaque and sure to yield scum when stirred." I had turned back to my notes when Holmes rose abruptly and moved to the window. Without comment, he drew back the curtain a finger's width and peered down to the street below. After a pause, he said, "He has circled the lamp-post 5 times now, and at precisely the same angle." I joined him, squinting through the mist. A man in a long coat paced the opposite pavement, pausing now and again to glance up at our window with the look of a soul hesitating on the edge of confession, or perhaps flight. "What do you make of his shoes, Watson?" I had barely formed a reply when Holmes answered his own question. "He will knock, but only once he's convinced he is not being followed. Note the left cuff, creased with nervous twisting. His hat is 3 years out of style, yet his gloves are new. The story is coming, Watson, though I suspect not in full." He returned to his chair without waiting for the bell. He carries with him the burden of a secret and the dampness of the Thames. I opened my mouth to ask how he could possibly know the latter when the sharp knock came at last. The man who entered wore his unease like an ill-fitting overcoat. His boots were slick with river mud, the sort one sees near the embankment at low tide. His hat, too wide for fashion, too shallow for the rain, sat awkwardly atop a shock of damp, thinning hair. There was a scar just above his right brow, the sort left by a blow long-healed but never forgotten. Holmes gestured toward the empty chair. The man sat stiffly, his eyes darting to every corner of the room, as though it too might hold a secret he feared. "I was followed," he said. "I believe my life is in danger," the man continued, his voice brittle and precise, like porcelain in the cold, though not by the usual means. "It is not a man with a knife I fear, but a shadow with my face." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "The matter concerns something lost," the man added, "or something believed lost, buried even. But now I am not so sure it stayed that way." I noticed the man's hands. One bore the faint mark of rope. Holmes, too, had seen it. "You have come about the river," he said softly, "and something that did not drown." He removed his gloves with a slow, deliberate motion, as though each finger required its own moment of courage. "My name is Nathaniel Warrington," he said. "I serve as a junior accountant at the Admiralty Office, though I doubt that detail will carry much weight once I've finished." His voice, though steady in pitch, bore the hollow resonance of someone who had repeated these words many times in solitude and found no comfort in the repetition. Holmes offered no greeting, only a faint nod and a glance toward the fire, which had dwindled to a tired orange glow. I noted the flicker in the man's eyes, a mixture of shame and dread, as he perched on the edge of the chair. I have come, he added, because I believe someone means to destroy me, not through violence, but through revelation, and I cannot say which would be worse. The man's gaze drifted momentarily to the window, where the fog still pressed its face like a ghost against the glass. It began 12 nights ago, he said quietly. I had just crossed the Thames Bridge, returning from a late supper with a colleague, when I caught sight of something, or someone, beneath the gaslight's pale ring. He hesitated. I thought it was my own reflection at first, distorted by mist and drink, but it moved before I did. Holmes leaned slightly forward. Moved? How? It turned its head and walked into the fog, Warrington replied. While I stood still, I was alone, quite alone, yet I felt as though I had been seen, studied even, by a man with my own features. I confess, I felt a chill at this, but Holmes only raised an eyebrow, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. A reflection with free will, he said. That is worth investigating. Since then, Warrington continued, it has not ceased. He adjusted his collar as if the very memory constricted his breath. At first it was mere glimpses, someone standing too still on the opposite pavement, or disappearing down an alley just as I turned. But more recently, he swallowed. There have been footsteps behind me, pauses when I pause, and a figure, always in a dark coat, watching from across the river. Holmes gave no indication of surprise. And you've informed no one? Who would believe me? Warrington's voice was tinged with desperation. A man chased by his own image. Men have been hounded by less, Holmes murmured. Tell me, did your shadow ever speak? Warrington shook his head. Not once. It only watches. I feel as if it is waiting for something. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Indeed. Shadows, Mr. Warrington, rarely wait for nothing. They are drawn to buried light or buried guilt. There was a silence then, long enough to be uncomfortable, during which Holmes simply observed the man as one might observe a chessboard at mid-game. Finally, Warrington seemed to yield to an inner pressure. 4 years ago, he said, I was assigned, quietly, to assist in a classified engineering project, a prototype for naval armament, experimental guidance systems for torpedoes. He paused. My superior was a man named Gregory Hatch, an eccentric but brilliant engineer. And what became of Mr. Hatch? Holmes inquired. He vanished, said Warrington. Drowned, they said, though no body was ever found. There was a great deal of speculation, but the file was sealed. Sealed by whom? By the same Admiralty that buried the rest, he replied. You see, there was an iron lockbox, heavy, watertight and sealed with naval wax. Hatch claimed it contained all blueprints and test data. He insisted it be destroyed if anything were to happen to him. And was it? Holmes asked. Warrington's gaze dropped to the floor. We threw it from the embankment ourselves, at high tide, watched it sink. But now I am not certain it stayed where it fell. Holmes's fingers drummed once on the armrest, then fell still. You swore the contents were gone. Why the doubt now? Warrington inhaled as though preparing to confess a crime. Because someone knows. I've received 3 letters, unsigned, asking how the water feels at midnight. His voice trembled. And this morning, someone slipped a torn scrap under my office door. From his coat, he drew a folded fragment of yellowed paper. Holmes examined it in silence. The edge had once borne official Admiralty lettering, now torn. On the back, written in a crude but deliberate hand, were the words, "You cannot bury what floats." Holmes's smile was thin and unreadable. Indeed. And do you believe it is Hatch returned? Warrington looked pale. Hatch is dead, but his secrets may not be. I could not help but lean forward. Why come to us then? Why not your superiors? Because if I report it, he said, I prove the box was never destroyed. And that implicates me, perhaps fatally. Holmes rose and walked to the hearth. "Ah, Watson," he said with a gleam in his eye. "At last, we are no longer idle." As Holmes returned the scrap to our visitor, I noticed his eyes flick once, only once, to the man's right wrist. There, just beneath the edge of the cuff, was the faint red line of a healing rope burn. "I dare say you have not slept well," Holmes remarked, not as a question. "You wear last night's shoes, muddied at the toe and damp still at the heel. Your nails are rimmed with dried grit, and there's a trace of oil beneath the second knuckle. You have been digging or dragging something." Warrington flinched, then steadied himself. "I went to the river," he admitted, "to look, to see if the lockbox had remained," Holmes finished for him. "And did it?" "I could not tell," said the man, almost in a whisper. "The current was strong, and I was watched." Holmes's voice was suddenly very quiet. "Indeed. But by whom, I wonder?" Holmes resumed his seat and steepled his fingers once more, his eyes half-lidded but alert beneath. "You tied a line to your waist," he said calmly, "and descended the bank near Blackfriars at the turning of the tide. You scraped your hands on stone, not wood, and found the water too deep to see clearly. Someone stood at a distance, perhaps behind the arch, but you said nothing. Am I correct?" Warrington stared speechless. "But how? The rope mark on your wrist is curved and recent. The grit beneath your nails contains flecks of riverbed silt, and the scent on your coat is not of the city's smoke, but algae, particularly one that grows thick near that stretch." I had, by this point, long ceased trying to follow Holmes's logic without aid. He turned to me briefly. "Do you know, Watson, what makes a man dig up a grave he swore to bury?" "Fear," I offered. "Or guilt." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Mr. Warrington's visit is not born of uncertainty, but of certainty. He believes the lockbox still exists because he needs it not to, and someone, it seems, is ensuring he remembers what was meant to be forgotten." The next morning found Holmes and me walking silently along the Thames, the damp chill seeping through our boots as we passed beneath the arched shadows of the embankment. Holmes, in one of his more austere moods, had discarded his usual pipe for a thin stick of licorice root, which he chewed with mild irritation as we descended a narrow flight of stone steps leading to the water's edge. "I find, Watson," he remarked, pausing to examine a scuff mark on the granite ledge, "that the river possesses a temperament not unlike our client's, deceptively still above, but rather more turbulent beneath." We posed no questions to the constables or officials. Holmes preferred the invisible routes, those lined by men who made their living not by the clock, but by the tide. At his bidding, we engaged with those who knew the river intimately, scavengers, dockhands, and boatmen, whose knowledge was as weathered as their hands. It was among these that the first thread was pulled. An old man, rheumy-eyed and shrewd, remembered something. "A fella in an oilskin coat," he said, "stooped by the columns a few nights back, like he'd dropped something or was trying to pull it back up. The old fellow who called himself Jem and claimed to have poled barges before the Empire had ever seen India, spoke with the practiced rhythm of one who has told many stories but believed few of them himself. It were 2, maybe 3 nights ago," he muttered, tugging his scarf tighter as Holmes placed a coin delicately on the barrel beside him. "There was a man. Could have been taller, maybe not. Hard to tell in that mist. But he had purpose, sir. Not like your usual drunk or vagrant." Holmes remained motionless, listening as though deciphering the rhythm of the man's breath. "And what did he do?" "Drop something, maybe, or hauled something up. Had a canvas roll, like painters use, but heavy." He tapped the side of his nose. "Didn't want to be seen, that much was clear. Looked over his shoulder more than once." "And when was this?" I asked. "That's the thing, Doctor. He says the thing was thrown in a week before, but I saw this chap just 3 nights past. Now either that box swims back on command, or someone's been diving in after it." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Or perhaps," he said, "both." Not far from the embankment, in a modest pub with a peeling green door and a reputation for leniency toward unpaid tabs, Holmes sought out another man, one who had once worn the Admiralty seal upon his waistcoat, though now he nursed gin in place of pride. The man's name was Tolliver, and his hands shook more from memory than drink. Holmes, with uncharacteristic patience, let the silence linger until the fellow spoke. "You want to know about Hatch?" he rasped, eyes unfocused. "Everyone does. Now that he's gone." "Gone or drowned?" Holmes asked. Tolliver gave a crooked smile. "That depends on what you call drowning. He was buried, but not by water." I leaned forward. "You knew him?" "Knew of him. Enough to stay out of his way. Brilliant man, but twitchy. Said too much to the wrong ear. There was talk of a leak, foreign interest. He was going to expose it." Holmes's tone remained soft. "And? Next thing we knew, he was dead. Only no funeral, no body, just a sealed file." "And you?" Holmes asked. "I lost my post." He lifted his glass. "Some things are buried deeper than a box, gentlemen, and some drownings don't leave ripples." The scavenger Holmes had selected was a sharp-nosed fellow with a limp and a patch sewn from newspaper across one knee. He went by the improbable name of Mr. Spinks and claimed to know every pebble of the Thames from Westminster to Rotherhithe. When Holmes handed him a half-crown and asked whether he'd seen anything odd near the water's edge these past 10 nights, the man's grin faltered into something more wary. "I seen a bundle," he said finally, near the 5th column below Millbank. Wrapped in thick canvas, heavy by the way it fell. Man dropped it hisself. Didn't throw like trash, but eased it in slow, like something worth keeping. He scratched his chin. "Not 3 nights ago." Holmes nodded once. "And afterward?" "Another man, day later, said he was from the Admiralty. Asked me near the same you just did. Wore a fine coat, but he weren't no officer. Had questions, not orders. I can smell the difference." "Did he give a name?" I asked. "Didn't offer it. Left in a hurry when I asked too much." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "It seems, Watson," he murmured, "the river may have had more than one visitor in recent tides." It was Holmes who first spotted it, a single boot print in the thick river mud, pressed into the slope near the stone base of the western arch. To my eyes it was unremarkable, perhaps even accidental, but Holmes, crouching beside it with feline grace, smiled faintly. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how the heel mark is at the higher edge and the toe lower. A man walking toward the river would leave the reverse." I leaned in. "Then he was backing away?" Holmes shook his head. "Not quite. He was facing the river. His boot twisted inward, his balance uneven. Likely he knelt here, with one foot down and the other braced, perhaps pulling something from the water. He took from his coat pocket the note Warrington had shown us. It would seem our visitor hoped to recover what was once thought lost. The sole's shape matched precisely the outline of Warrington's boot, which Holmes had memorized during our interview, and yet the timing did not match our client's claim. "He has not told us the whole of it," Holmes murmured. "But whether by omission or fear remains to be seen." "And the other man?" I asked. Holmes straightened. "He may yet return, with drier feet or dirtier hands." Holmes remained silent for much of the walk back to Westminster, until we reached the narrow lane where Mr. Spinks had first directed us. There he paused beneath the weathered ironwork of a forgotten pier and lit a cigarette with deliberate slowness. "You noted, Watson, that the scavenger described his second inquirer as an Admiralty man, yet the language and manner were all wrong." "Yes," I said, "and no badge shown, no identification offered." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "The genuine agents of the Crown tend not to shy from authority. This man did. That suggests he was neither authorized nor confident, merely pretending at power." "But why?" I asked. to scare off witnesses, or to learn what the witnesses know. He stepped forward, tapping the heel of his boot against a loose cobble. The river has its own memory, Watson. The water forgets, but the mud does not, and someone is trying to trace a very particular memory buried beneath it. Then this imposter, he seeks the lockbox as well? Holmes exhaled smoke into the wind. Yes, but not as a patriot, I suspect. No, this is not a man defending a secret. This is a man hoping to possess it. Our inquiries led us next to a humble lodging house in Lambeth, where the name Mrs. Hatch still adorned the cracked postbox in faded gilt. It was Holmes who insisted upon the visit, though I confess I expected little from a grieving mother after so many years. She opened the door herself. An elderly woman, thin as a reed, with eyes sharp as winter wind. She invited us in with no ceremony, as if she had long awaited such callers. "You've come about Gregory," she said before we'd spoken a word. Holmes nodded. "We are told he drowned." She gave a brittle laugh. "That's what they told me too. But I saw the men who came for him, 3 of them, uniformed but not of the Navy. They said it was official business. I never saw my son again." Holmes sat forward. "And the lockbox?" She hesitated. "Gregory mentioned it, said it was the only proof he had. Proof they couldn't silence unless it sank. Did he name who they were?" She shook her head. "He feared them too much." When we departed, Holmes was pensive. "Dead men tell no tales, Watson, but their mothers often remember the parts that matter." Back in our rooms that evening, Holmes stood by the window, watching the gas lamps flicker through the mist. "It never sank," he said abruptly. "The box, or if it did, it was not left alone for long. Too many footprints now led back to the water, a shadowed client, a counterfeit agent, and whispers from the past. Someone searches not to protect a secret, but to wield it." I offered him a brandy, which he declined. "We must return to the bridge," he added, "but not to look down, Watson. This time, we watch who dares look in." The fog that night was the kind that swallowed sound, thick enough to render even footsteps dreamlike and distant. Holmes had insisted we keep our watch in silence, crouched beneath the iron lip of the bridge, our backs pressed to cold stone. He had chosen the hour with the same precision he applied to the alignment of test tubes, the turn of the tide, when the river's pull was at its most restless. "This is the hour of return," he whispered, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Those who fear discovery never choose the brightness of day." We had waited nearly an hour when Holmes raised one hand, a signal I had learned not to question. From the far end of the embankment, a shape detached itself from the fog, tall, cloaked, moving with cautious intent. The figure paused near the same column where Warrington's print had been found. A glint of metal emerged, a hook or grapnel, and the stranger lowered something slowly into the river. Holmes's hand tensed on my sleeve. Just then, a distant clatter, perhaps a loose stone, broke the stillness. The figure spun sharply and fled, disappearing into the mist before we could give chase. Holmes rose, brushed the damp from his coat, and murmured, "He came not to bury Watson, but to resurrect." Holmes was already at the base of the column before I had found my footing. The rope was still there, wet, knotted, and trailing back into the black water. With gloved fingers, he retrieved it, and from the depths emerged a canvas satchel, dripping and heavy, its mouth crudely stitched shut with twine. He was in haste, Holmes observed, and lacked the time to finish what he began. I knelt beside him as he carefully opened the satchel. Inside, among soaked cloths and stones meant for ballast, lay a small leather-bound ledger, warped from water, but intact. It bore no title, no insignia, no clasp. Yet Holmes treated it as though it were made of glass. "It was never meant to surface," he said. As he turned it over, a slip of folded paper fell into his palm. On it, a series of numbers and initials arranged in 2 tight columns. coded clearly, but with too neat a structure to be personal musings. Holmes tucked the note into his inner pocket and closed the satchel. "Anything else?" I asked. He shook his head. "Only this. The man wore oilskin, practical, concealing, naval issue or imitation thereof, but his boots were wrong, too clean, too new. A fisherman does not fear mud, Watson, but a man impersonating one, he fears everything." Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the ledger upon the hearthstone to dry, its leather curling at the corners like a leaf in autumn. He examined it not with curiosity, but with reverence, as if it were a relic exhumed from some forgotten chapel of secrets. "Note the ruling," he said, flipping through its pages. "Narrow columns, uniform spacing, ink from the same nib. No idle scrawl here. This is a register. A financial one. Indeed, or rather, an operational ledger. Observe. Here, the entries shift every 6 days. The gaps coincide with known shipping lanes, and the numbers increase, suggesting growing sums or shipments." He paused at a page where the ink had bled, but the characters remained decipherable. RH, GH, NW. "Initials," I said. Holmes nodded, but not random. RH for Renfield Hatch, GH for Gregory Hatch, no doubt, and NW, our own Mr. Warrington. He tapped the bottom margin. "There are dates. This one, 5 days ago, matches the time Warrington claims he first saw his reflection. And you believe this ledger connects them?" "I believe it binds them," Holmes replied. "What began as an operation was transmuted into blackmail, and what was buried, Watson, was not just a box, but a pact." Holmes spent the next morning bent over that ledger with the devotion of a monk transcribing scripture. The cipher, though not overly complex, had been written with a thoroughness that suggested military familiarity, a substitution system wrapped in shifting intervals. By mid-morning, he set down his pen with a faint exhalation and passed me a single page, now annotated with his own neat script. "Read aloud, Watson." I did so, stumbling only once. "Payments received. RH 200, N Busa 300, EH 250, delivered to third party as arranged. Remaining funds to be held until retrieval complete." "EH," I said slowly. "That's not Gregory." "No," Holmes said. "That is Eleanor Hatch, his sister." The name struck me with an odd unease. "But I thought she drowned in a shipping accident, or so the report claimed." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "But reports are only as truthful as the men who write them. If Eleanor Hatch lives and she receives payment, then the tragedy of the Hatches may not be as final as recorded. And the amounts increase over time," Holmes said, "which suggests urgency or fear. Someone is paying dearly to keep this circle silent." He tapped the ledger's final line. "NW, additional incentive promised if interference resumes." Interference, Watson. That is us. The following day, Holmes disappeared for several hours, returning with mud-streaked trousers and a face alight with that rare and unsettling gleam which meant he had confirmed more than he intended to share. He said little, save for asking me to retrieve a directory of Admiralty staff, past and present. With the pages spread across our table, Holmes traced a finger slowly down the W's. "Nathaniel Warrington," he murmured. "Junior accountant, now. But 4 years ago, seconded briefly to a confidential engineering post, quietly reassigned after Hatch's disappearance. No promotion since, and no public disgrace," I added. "Precisely," said Holmes, "which tells us everything. The Admiralty swept it under, Watson, not because he failed, but because they couldn't afford a scandal." I watched as he drew a line connecting Warrington's name to Gregory Hatch's, and then to Eleanor's, beside the name H. Shipping Co. A failed venture dissolved shortly after Hatch's supposed death. Warrington was not Hatch's enemy, Holmes said. He was his accomplice, until fear changed the terms. And now? I asked. Holmes leaned back. Now someone's cleaning up the past, and the payments in that ledger were not hush money alone. They were buy-offs, delays, bribes. For what purpose? Holmes's eyes narrowed. To keep a secret submerged, or to ensure no one else retrieves it first. That evening, at Holmes's request, Mr. Warrington returned to Baker Street. He entered stiffly, hat in hand, eyes hollowed by dread. Holmes did not rise, nor offer tea, but gestured to the armchair opposite. "I trust," Holmes said, "that the water was colder than you remembered." Warrington flinched, but said nothing. Holmes continued, his tone mild. "You tied a rope to your waist. You returned to the same location by the bridge. You attempted to retrieve the lockbox or confirm its absence. But you were not alone, were you?" I don't know what you mean." Holmes produced the ledger and placed it on the table between them. "You were not followed by a stranger, Mr. Warrington. You were shadowed by the consequences of your own deception." Warrington's hand trembled. "You helped Hatch design the prototype," Holmes said. "But when things turned dangerous, you chose self-preservation over loyalty." "I was told it had been handled," he whispered. Holmes's voice hardened. "You were told lies and passed them on until the truth clawed its way back to the surface." Warrington bowed his head. "I never meant harm. I only wanted it forgotten." "Then why return to the river?" "Because someone wouldn't let me forget." Holmes leaned forward. "Who, Mr. Warrington? Who keeps pulling at the rope?" Warrington did not answer, at least not in words. His silence, raw and vibrating, filled the room more powerfully than any confession. It was Holmes who spoke next. "Gregory Hatch is not dead." I stared. "But his mother, the reports." "Convenient illusions," Holmes replied. "The body was never recovered. The witnesses were few, the file sealed, and now funds traced to Eleanor Hatch's name, a woman likewise presumed dead, yet very much alive if the ledger speaks true." Warrington raised his eyes slowly. "You think Gregory's alive? After all this?" Holmes nodded. "Alive and very precise. The messages you've received, the scrap beneath your door, the shadow by the bridge, they were not meant to harm you. Not yet. They were a warning. Hatch does not want revenge. He wants silence, until he's ready to speak on his own terms." "But why the disguise?" I asked. "Why oilskin and shadows?" "Because truth moves safer when unseen," Holmes said. "If Hatch has survived, he knows he is hunted, either by those who betrayed him or those who want his invention buried, or both." Warrington buried his face in his hands. "I didn't betray him. I was afraid. They came for him. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Holmes said. "But fear is often the architect of treason. The question is no longer what happened 4 years ago. It is what Gregory Hatch intends to do now." He turned to me. "And if I am right, Watson, we have only sons before he makes that intention known." It was Holmes's idea, naturally, not merely to uncover the truth, but to invite it to unmask itself under his terms. A rendezvous was arranged with great care, ostensibly between Nathaniel Warrington and an interested buyer who claimed to possess an appetite for submerged truths. "The bait must be just ambiguous enough," Holmes said, "to tempt a conscience already half prepared to surface." Warrington protested. Of course, his nerves were wound tight, and his complexion had taken on a greyish hue that reminded me of ash after the fire has gone out. But Holmes reassured him with that particular brand of icy confidence which made disagreement feel somehow impolite. "He will not expect a trap," Holmes told him, "because thus far he has encountered only cowards." And so it was that we found ourselves once again by the river's edge, with Holmes donning the persona of a foreign arms broker, and Warrington tasked with passing a fabricated message. that the lockbox's contents had been retrieved and were ready for sale, at a price. "This will draw out our ghost," Holmes murmured as we stood beneath the gaslight. Not Hatch himself, necessarily, but the one who fears what Hatch might reveal. And fear, Watson, is the most punctual of motivators. I offered no reply. My eyes were on Warrington, who paced the edge of the quay like a condemned man awaiting reprieve. "Midnight," Holmes said, consulting his pocket watch. "London's most faithful accomplice. Let us see if the river keeps its appointment." Inspector Lestrade arrived 10 minutes early, wearing the expression of a man resigned to another sleepless night in service of someone else's theory. Holmes greeted him with polite indifference, then gestured toward the shadows beneath the arches. "Your constable?" he asked. "Stationed just beyond the pilings," Lestrade replied. "Though if you ask me, this entire escapade would be better suited to the theatre than Scotland Yard." "Your scepticism is, as ever, refreshing," Holmes replied dryly. "But I ask only for your silence and your timing." Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "And what precisely are we arresting them for?" "Prematurely? Nothing," Holmes said. "But if my calculations are correct, someone will draw a weapon, or something heavier, before the end of the hour." He handed Lestrade a small slip of paper, a duplicate of the torn cipher note Warrington had received. "This, if dropped near the body, will make things very official." Lestrade sighed. "Fine then. But I warn you, Holmes, if this ends with a cat in a burlap sack and a midnight confession from a chimney sweep, I'm resigning." Holmes did not reply. He merely turned and walked away with the quiet efficiency of a man who had already accounted for every objection and discounted it. Holmes, now thoroughly transformed by a false moustache, Eastern accent, and the posture of one who had seen too many back-alley dealings, stood beside a battered wooden crate marked "Machinery, Fragile." Upon it rested a leather pouch filled not with cash, but carefully folded newspaper and iron slugs. Warrington stood several paces behind, visibly trembling. Holmes had instructed him to say little, only to watch, and to speak the phrase exactly as rehearsed. "It is not the contents that are for sale, but the silence around them." The words echoed faintly in the damp air. Minutes passed. Then from the gloom, footsteps, measured, deliberate. A figure emerged, cloaked and indistinct, with one gloved hand tucked inside the folds of his coat. He did not speak at once. Instead, he studied Holmes with the cold caution of a man assessing both value and danger. "You have it?" the figure asked, voice hoarse and low. Holmes inclined his head. "I have what was taken from the Thames." "You have what?" "A key," the man replied, "and a promise." "A dangerous currency," Holmes said smoothly. The man stepped forward, revealing a glimpse of oilskin beneath his coat. The box was never meant for auction. "And yet, here we are," Holmes murmured. There was a pause, then a flicker of movement toward the coat's interior. Holmes's eyes flicked once toward the shadows. "Now, Lestrade." The trap snapped shut with stunning precision. Lestrade and his constable surged from the gloom, revolver drawn, and the cloaked figure wheeled round, not in panic, but in eerie calm. What followed was not a shout or plea, but the sound of a revolver being cocked. The weapon emerged from the folds of the oilskin coat, small, compact, glinting in the lamplight. Lestrade raised his own. "Drop it," he barked. But Holmes, eyes fixed and voice sharp, said instead, "Don't fire." The figure did not resist. Slowly, deliberately, the weapon was lowered and then released into the mud with a soft thud. Lestrade moved in, seized the assailant by the shoulders, and recoiled. "It's a woman," he muttered. Holmes stepped forward, unfastening the coat's collar. I gasped. Beneath the hat and shadowed face was a woman no older than 35, sharp-jawed, with pale eyes and damp hair drawn back tightly. "Eleanor Hatch," Holmes said quietly. She met his gaze without fear. "You're late," she said. Holmes gave a faint smile. "On the contrary, Miss Hatch, we arrived just as you expected us to." Lestrade looked utterly bewildered. "But she's supposed to be—" "Dead," Holmes said. "Most secrets are, until they resurface." And with that, the river, once again, swallowed its silence. The moment of recognition was brief, and then chaos, swift as a gust through dead leaves. Eleanor Hatch lunged, not with the wild fury of a desperate woman, but with a deliberate, practiced aggression that startled even Lestrade. Her hand reached for the fallen revolver. Holmes stepped between them with astonishing speed. She struck out, not blindly, but with intent, catching his arm, nearly knocking the weapon loose. "Careful, Watson!" Holmes called out, and I, with far less grace, moved to intercept her from behind. She twisted away, agile as a cat, and in a blink was again at the river's edge, boots skidding on the damp stone. "Eleanor, no!" cried Warrington, his voice strained and desperate. But she turned not to him. Her eyes were fixed on Holmes, blazing with a fierce, haunted clarity. "You think this is justice?" she spat. "You, with your clever tricks and tidy conclusions." Holmes gave no reply. Instead, he moved slowly, hands slightly raised. "I think," he said calmly, "that the river has seen enough lies buried beneath it. Don't you?" In the flickering gaslight, I caught the glint of something small and silver in her hand. A locket, perhaps. Her fingers curled around it as though it were armour. She faltered. For a long moment, none of us moved. The city seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a long exhale, Eleanor dropped to her knees, trembling. The fight was gone. Only the story remained. It was not until Lestrade gently lifted the hood from her head that I truly saw her. The woman beneath bore traces of the man we had believed her to be. Same fine-boned features, same keen eyes. But they were a sister's eyes, and in them burned a deeper grief. Holmes stepped back, brushing mud from his sleeve. "You must forgive the deception, Watson," he said. "The resemblance to her brother is more than mere biology. It is a shared obsession." I thought she drowned," I stammered. "The storm, the wreck off Calais." "She wished to be presumed dead," Holmes replied, "and the sea is a most obliging accomplice to those who wish to vanish." Eleanor gave a soft, bitter laugh. "And yet, it was the river that betrayed me." Holmes nodded toward her coat. "It was the stitching that gave you away," he said. "Military thread, repurposed by a left-handed tailor. Unique enough once one bothers to look." Lestrade seemed uncharacteristically quiet, as if unsure whether to treat her as villain or victim. "You impersonated your brother?" he asked finally. "I became him," she replied, not with pride, but with something colder, because no one else would carry what he died protecting. Warrington stepped forward. "Eleanor, if you had simply spoken to me." Her eyes cut to him, sharp as a blade. "Spoken? When you sold him for a pension and silence?" The accusation hung in the mist between them. "I had to know," she whispered, "if what he died for was ever worth it." Eleanor's hands were no longer trembling. There was a peculiar stillness about her now, as though the confession had finally steadied something that had long roiled within. "I knew Gregory would never abandon his post," she said. "He wrote to me, you know, even after I was gone. He thought I was in South Africa." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at the locket still clutched in her hand. "When the reports came in, the betrayal, the leak, his so-called suicide, I knew it was a lie. But it wasn't until I returned that I saw how deep the rot had gone. Gregory's name was whispered like a stain. And your silence," she turned to Warrington again, "confirmed everything." Warrington's face had gone pallid. "I protected the institution," he muttered. "Not myself." Holmes arched an eyebrow. Indeed, the institution, which, curiously, included a sizable inheritance, a rapid promotion, and the quiet acquisition of Hatch's research into naval encryption. Warrington opened his mouth, but no words emerged. "I did not intend to kill him," Eleanor said quietly. "Only to haunt him." Holmes gave a rare, almost sympathetic nod. And what better ghost than a sister presumed dead? There was no victory in her expression, only exhaustion. Her vengeance, like so many before her, had proved a hollow meal. Later, as we watched Eleanor escorted into Lestrade's carriage, I turned to Holmes. "You knew all along, didn't you, that the lockbox was never in her possession?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The tides, Watson. They are more honest than any confession. Based on the current and her original account, the box would have drifted precisely 3/4 of a mile downstream and lodged, as I suspected, in the silt beneath the third pier of the Waterloo footbridge. You recovered it before tonight?" "A week ago," he replied. "Our performance this evening was for Eleanor's benefit and Warrington's undoing." I shook my head. "You turned the entire affair into a theatre." "Of course," Holmes said, lighting his pipe. "The most effective traps are not those built of bars and chains, but of truth dressed in the costume of opportunity." He gazed once more at the river. "The box is safe. The secrets within, neutralized, and the ghosts." He exhaled smoke into the fog. "Some will always linger, Watson, but this one may now sleep." It was nearing dawn when we arrived once more at Baker Street, our boots damp with river spray, and the Thames mist clinging like breath to a mirror. Holmes said little on the cab ride, but I could see the peculiar brightness in his eyes, the gleam of mental satisfaction, as though every synapse of his mind had fired in harmony. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet, had left tea warming on the grate. Holmes declined it naturally and instead paced to the window, fingers pressed together, his gaze fixed on the fog-bound horizon as though some fragment of the case still lingered out there. "Well?" I ventured, loosening my scarf and lowering myself into the armchair with a weariness that had seeped into my bones. "You have the box, the confession, and the culprit. But I feel, as ever, that I am a few steps behind." Holmes turned at once. "Then allow me to remedy your ailment, my dear Watson. For what is a solved case, if not a story half told?" He lit a cigarette and began his account with the dispassionate clarity of a surgeon detailing a clean incision. Every movement of the players, every whisper of motive and error, unfolded under his narration like a carefully shuffled deck of cards. The key, he said, was not Eleanor Hatch's reappearance, nor the lockbox, nor even Warrington's peculiar distress. It was the human soul, and its curious resistance to rest when guilt burrows deep. "You will recall," Holmes began, "that Warrington reported being followed, shadowed by a pale figure he glimpsed reflected in a glass door. He believed it to be Gregory Hatch, risen, perhaps, from the grave." I nodded. The incident in the fog, yes, it shook him. And rightly so, for guilt sharpens the imagination. But the reflection was no ghost. It was Eleanor. He gestured towards his pipe as though it were a pointer. She began stalking him not as vengeance, but as theatre, a calculated haunting. She selected her moments with the precision of a dramatist, the glint of a face in glass, the echo of a step in a corridor, a misplaced scent of salt water in a dry room. I sat up straighter. So she meant to unnerve him? Not simply unnerve. She meant to weaken him, Holmes replied. To sap his certainty, to corrode his composure until a single misstep would betray him. But why not confront him outright? Holmes gave a short laugh. Because the mind confesses far more readily to itself than to others. Her presence was a scalpel, subtle, patient, and devastating. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, and one I could scarcely credit even as Holmes laid it bare. Eleanor Hatch had not simply returned from the dead. She had fashioned herself into a ghost and turned Warrington's conscience into a stage. Effective, Holmes murmured, but not quite precise enough. It was his body, not his mind, that betrayed him. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece and tapped his pipe twice before continuing. You saw it, Watson, though you did not see it, he said. The faint mark around Warrington's right wrist, as though from a cord or loop. Old, but not ancient. A week at most. I thought it a mark from a tight cuff. Precisely what he hoped you'd think. But the flesh was rubbed in a pattern consistent with damp friction, not linen, more akin to rope. I frowned. But how does that fit into... He went to retrieve the lockbox himself, Holmes cut in. The tide was unusually high 4 nights ago. He likely went under the bridge with a length of rope affixed to a grappling pole, or perhaps himself, in order to drag the box from where he believed it lodged. But failed? Evidently, Holmes said. The current under that span is treacherous. The mud alone could pull down a barge, let alone a half-panicked civil servant with trembling hands and a guilty heart. I stared into the hearth. So while Eleanor shadowed him from the shore, he was wading into the river, hoping to bury his mistake. Holmes gave a faint, almost sorrowful nod. The burn told the truth, Watson. Not the eyes, nor the words, but that simple abrasion. Men may deceive others, but rarely do they fool the laws of physics. And so you knew he was more than a bystander. I knew, Holmes said, that he had already tried and failed, which meant he was desperate, and desperation, he concluded, always leaves a trail. There is a peculiar rhythm, Holmes said, resuming his seat, in the minds of men who carry guilt like a hidden wound. At first, they deny it. Then they attempt to mask it. And finally, they act rashly in order to bury it. He glanced sideways at me. Warrington had reached the 3rd phase. I stirred my tea without tasting it. So you anticipated the paranoia? From the moment he failed to retrieve the box, Holmes said, guilt does not remain dormant. It metastasizes, and in men like Warrington, proud, fragile, it manifests as suspicion. He came to believe Eleanor might kill him. He began to believe you suspected him, even if you did not. I confess, I said, I did wonder if his nerves would snap. They very nearly did. And that, dear Watson, was the theatre's true purpose. Eleanor did not need to kill him, merely to push him to confess by nudging him to the edge. Holmes poured himself a 2nd cup of tea, unusually generous with the sugar. And once he confessed, she was no longer a criminal, I murmured, merely a sister who sought the truth. Justice, Holmes said softly, is not always served by courts. Sometimes it is dragged from a man's own mouth, in the dark, by fear and a whisper of footsteps behind him. He rose, stretching like a cat. Now then, Watson, enough darkness. There is a matinee at Covent Garden and an unsolved telegram from Sussex. Which shall we address first? I smiled. You already know which you'll choose. Holmes smirked. Naturally. Holmes had remained silent for some minutes after recounting the full design of Eleanor Hatch's campaign, his eyes half-lidded and fingers steepled beneath his chin. I, meanwhile, could not decide whether to be impressed or troubled. She played her hand remarkably, I said finally. I dare say even you admire the precision of her scheme. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Indeed, she played a part with more nuance than most actresses on the West End. She knew her audience intimately, Warrington's fears, his guilt, his memories. She composed the drama of his undoing with the cold patience of a clockmaker. And yet, I ventured, there is something unsettling in it. She blurred the lines between justice and personal vendetta. Quite so, Holmes replied. And therein lies the danger of private morality. Her cause may have had merit, but her method relied on illusion, fear, and emotional coercion, not unlike the very tools used by the man she sought to punish. I stirred in my chair. But was it not effective? Effectiveness is no shield against the erosion of principle, Holmes said coolly. Eleanor Hatch sought justice, but what she delivered was theatre. And theatre, Watson, no matter how clever, is but a mirror turned inward. Truth cannot long be sustained by fiction. He tapped his finger against his lips. She is intelligent, yes, but there is peril in intellect unmoored from humility. The abyss gazes, as the Germans say, and Miss Hatch has stared rather too long. Inspector Lestrade arrived that afternoon with the brisk step of a man prepared to lecture, and a notepad already half filled. His moustache bristled with righteous tension until Holmes offered him tea, which he took with an air of reluctant civility. "I should be charging half the parties involved, Mr. Holmes," he said after the initial explanations. "There's been deceit, stalking, and the handling of evidence without police supervision." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And yet, no law breached directly, no hand laid upon the accused, no stolen object retained, only words whispered and nerves unstrung." Lestrade scowled. "You make it sound like amateur dramatics." "In a sense it was," Holmes replied, "but effective ones. And the criminal confessed, did he not?" Lestrade huffed. "Yes, though not to a magistrate. And Eleanor Hatch, a witness, and a sister. She orchestrated the entire charade. She acted," Holmes said calmly, "as a woman who had been deceived, robbed, and bereaved. If you wish to summon her, I shall not stop you, but I would remind you that your office is already crowded with guiltier men." Lestrade looked into his teacup. "Interference," he muttered. "That's what I'll call it." "Wise," Holmes replied. Lestrade closed his notebook with an audible snap. "You bend the rules like a violin, Holmes." "Only when the tune requires it," Holmes murmured. And thus it was settled, not by statute, but by understanding. In that room, the law bowed ever so slightly to the tangled weight of justice and grief. It was late evening when Holmes finally turned his attention to the recovered lockbox, a battered iron thing, its clasp rusted and corroded by the Thames' brackish embrace. He opened it with neither flourish nor ceremony, and within lay a sheaf of papers bound by twine and a single folded letter. Holmes examined the documents with swift, clinical movements. "Blueprints," he said. "Schematics of the newly proposed dock expansion, with annotations. Gregory Hatch suspected that Warrington was manipulating contracts to benefit private investors. This confirms it." He set them aside and opened the letter, his eyes scanning the contents before passing it silently to me. The handwriting was firm, elegant, and unmistakably deliberate. Gregory Hatch had composed it, apparently some weeks before his supposed disappearance. "If this letter finds its way to you, Eleanor, then I fear the worst has happened. I have made enemies by attempting to correct what should never have been hidden. If I fall, do not seek revenge. Seek the truth, and let that be enough." I looked up from the page, the words stinging more for their restraint than sentiment. "He did not wish her to avenge him," I said. "He wished her to understand him," Holmes replied, "and perhaps to forgive the world, even as it refused to forgive him." The papers were placed back inside the box, the letter folded as it had been. "Some truths," Holmes said, "are meant to outlive the lies that buried them." The next morning found us walking again along the Thames, a thin veil of autumn fog curling about our legs like the memory of smoke. Holmes, as ever, was coatless and imperturbable, his gaze trained not on the path, but upon the currents, as though the river still whispered its secrets. "She has left London," I said. "Eleanor, I mean, took the morning train." Holmes nodded without looking at me. "You think she found peace?" "She found closure," he said. "Peace may take longer." We passed beneath the bridge where Warrington had stood in shadow days before. The tide licked hungrily at the stonework. "I cannot help but wonder," I murmured, "whether justice was done." Holmes paused, then turned to me with that peculiar detachment which often masked his deepest reflections. "Justice, my dear Watson, is rarely a single event. It is a mosaic assembled from imperfect pieces. Eleanor gave one, flawed though it may be. Lestrade another. And we, perhaps we simply held the lantern. A gull cried overhead. I drew my coat tighter. There are secrets, Holmes continued, that do not drown. They settle, like silt, until stirred, and when the water clears again, they remain, heavier than stone, harder than steel. I looked at him. And what of the future? He gave a rare smile. A baronet in Sussex has telegraphed. Something about poisoned roses and a missing gardener. Shall we take the case? Of course. The river may hold secrets, Watson, but they are not the only ones worth chasing. We walked again by the Thames that morning, Holmes and I, as the fog returned in slow, curling waves. Not with menace, but as a final act draws its curtain. The city seemed hushed, as if reluctant to disturb the river's uneasy sleep. Holmes, hands behind his back, made no attempt at conversation. He moved with the light step of a man already leagues ahead in thought. It struck me how familiar the rhythm had become. The storm of deduction, the brief release, and then the silence. London, for all its engines and industry, seemed forever caught in that pattern. The crimes changed. The men remained the same. A tug's horn cried from upriver, startling a gull into flight. Holmes did not look up. He stared into the murk, as if trying to glimpse something just beneath its surface. Not a body this time, but an answer still floating out of reach. "Do you never tire of it, Holmes?" I asked softly, not turning toward him. "The endless chasing of shadows, the knowledge that for every truth uncovered, another slips away unnoticed." He paused, and I felt his eyes on me, sharp as frost. "Tire of it, Watson," he echoed. "It is not a matter of fatigue. The world tires of itself far quicker than I tire of its riddles." I smiled faintly. "Even riddles must grow thin with time." He considered this. "Perhaps, but it is not the novelty that sustains me. It is the pattern. Each crime is a window into the machinery of man's conscience. Clumsy, rusted, and occasionally magnificent in its misfiring. It is the closest thing I know to music. And the dissonance does not grate. On the contrary, it reminds me that the notes were composed by creatures no more orderly than ourselves." He turned once more to the river. "And yet it flows." "The Thames," Holmes murmured, "is the most honest of London's witnesses. It does not judge, but it does not forget." I followed his gaze, watching the eddies twist and tumble like thoughts too bitter to voice. "You sound almost poetic." "Merely observant," he replied. "Observe long enough, and even the mundane acquires verse." He pointed with his cane. "See how the current swallows what is thrown into it. A glove, a letter, a lie, but never releases them truly. The river holds memory, Watson, not as a ledger does, but as the mind does. It is stained, fragmented, often unreliable, but curiously incapable of forgetting. And yet," I said, "it is we who do the remembering." "Do we?" he asked with a glint. "Or do we merely revisit our own half-truths and call them recollection?" I had no reply. The river, shifting and opaque, seemed to echo his words more clearly than I ever could. I suggested, perhaps half-heartedly, that we attend a performance at the Adelphi that evening. "There's a new adaptation of Marlowe," I said. "Some critics call it brilliant." Holmes sniffed. "No actor," he replied, "can compete with a man intent on deception. A villain on the stage is bound by script and applause. A villain in life writes his lines as he commits them, and the audience is none the wiser." He glanced sidelong at me. "Besides, I detest curtain calls. I prefer exits without applause, or witnesses." It was, I thought, the most theatrical statement he had ever made. As we passed once more beneath Blackfriars Bridge, Holmes slowed. The fog had thickened, but his eyes remained steady, fixed on the flow below. There are secrets the river cannot keep, he said. Because they resurface? No, he said quietly. Because they never truly sink. The sound of water against stone filled the silence between us. Somewhere below, the lockbox had once rested, heavy with guilt, buoyed by memory. Now it was gone, and yet its weight remained. Holmes straightened. Come, Watson, the river has spoken, but we are not yet done listening elsewhere. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with a silver tray and a frown. A telegram lay upon it, thick cream paper creased by haste. Holmes read it and smiled. Well, Watson, a baronet in Sussex claims his roses have been poisoned. Shall we indulge him? I nodded. The game continued. As we reached Baker Street and the morning light curled against the curtains, Holmes removed his coat with the air of a man divesting himself of an unneeded mask. He lit his pipe and leaned back in his armchair with that peculiar serenity which only followed the solving of a particularly delicate affair. It is curious, Watson, he mused, how often guilt finds no need for prison walls. It fashions its own, out of fear, out of memory, out of silence. Our quarry was not chased down by the law, but by the echo of a sister's footsteps and the weight of what he buried. He exhaled a plume of smoke. Some secrets fester in locked boxes, but others walk beside us in the fog. What do you think truly unravelled Warrington in the end? The cleverness of Holmes' trap, the return of a presumed dead sister, or the inescapable burden of his own conscience? Tell us what you believe was the fatal flaw. And don't forget to subscribe for more chilling mysteries from Baker Street. Share this case with a fellow detective-minded friend, and together keep the game afoot.